Right. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about the role of AI and EdTech to help education to evolve from COVID-19 and the emergency teaching that went on, so that we can look at more effective learning ecosystems. But I think we're all learning at the moment, so I'm not going to say I have all the answers. I think we're all learning coming out of this pandemic, hopefully, about how technology, but particularly AI, might help us in the future. And certainly we were all taken by surprise by the pandemic. And I think even into late last year, we were still hoping things would pass through more quickly than they have. And to be frank, as we know, the situation is still actually quite hard to predict because of what's happening in India. But certainly everything was thrown into quite a lot of disarray, with students learning wherever they could in many very, very different circumstances, causing lots of anxiety and certainly many people missing the company of other people in the real world. And we wanted to understand a little bit about this. And so what I'm going to tell you about in the next few minutes is quite UK centric, but I have been talking to people in many other countries about their experiences. And I think some of the findings that we have will resonate with others. And so we looked at what data we could collect, obviously as a team of data scientists and people with AI expertise. We wanted to know what we could learn from this. And so we wanted to understand about all of the stakeholders, not just schools. So we engaged with parents, we engaged with teachers, we engaged with some learners as well, with policymakers, with educational leaders. And we did this through surveys, through interviews, and also through scraping data from Twitter and even looking at some websites for information to try and also doing a literature review of the other studies that were going on. So it was a very mixed methods approach to trying to understand multiple stakeholders. And what we found, I think, is really interesting. And certainly it's something we're very focused on in thinking about the future when it comes to AI and technology. So it was very clear that we gained a lot from focusing on the whole ecosystem. When schools stopped for the majority of pupils, there was a tendency to focus just on the school, but actually by looking beyond the school, we learned a lot. And in particular, ineffective connections between groups, between government and school leaders, between parents and schools, parents and learners. You can imagine those missing and ineffective connections and communications compromised the integrity of the whole system. And whereas a well-structured, well-supported ecosystem is self-supporting and can be quite resilient when battered by change, actually the lack of connection and communication disabled the education system from being as self-supporting as it could have been. And one of the other key things that we found was that in the messaging, there was a tendency to treat people as the same. You're a teacher, therefore, you're a parent, therefore. But actually, through looking at the ways in which there were differences in the way that people felt supported or not, who was supporting them, in looking at the way that different educational opportunities were being identified, concerns were really being reported, we found we were able to actually see some quite distinct differences. Now, the wonder that is AI, and it has some good and some bad things about it, but one of the great things about AI is that it can be very adaptive, which means in theory, and in many cases in practice, you can have an AI technology that can adapt to individual needs. But when it comes to looking at an entire education system, perhaps as a policymaker or an educational leader, you can't really adapt to every individual. So it's useful to know if there are personas, categories that might help you understand how to support one group better than another group, what different people need. And we used this to come up with 5 personas that we gave these names: aeronauts, earth movers, fire tamers, water pilots, and space seekers. You can see where we're coming from in the elements there. And it was interesting to see the differences. And actually, we found that people have started to engage with this and ask themselves, oh, am I an aeronaut or am I a fire tamer? And this wasn't just teachers, this was everybody who we were interviewing and working with. And the differences, so our aeronauts did feel well supported, did feel optimistic, could recognize the value of technology. And even though they didn't necessarily know exactly how to leverage it, they were confident that they would be able to. So my slides are moving. Oh, gosh, it's very sensitive. Let's go back there. So we've got aeronauts and then earth movers. And with the earth movers, actually were much more focused on infrastructure and trying to promote well-being and communication, because that's what they really needed to do. And so they were focused on the pedagogical grounding. And you can see that actually these were predominantly found in parents, teachers, students, educational leaders who were involved with independent schools, i.e. fee-paying schools, and in the secondary, that's ages 11 to 18. Our fire tamers, which was the largest group, particularly in the state sector, so non-fee paying, and particularly again in secondary schools, they were really having to tackle challenges. As the name suggests, they were having to get the things in order in some of the very basic things like getting devices for children, trying to get connectivity, trying to get some of the tools and support so that they could then get on with the teaching. And so that was their main role. And yet huge amounts of evidence that actually, given the right support, given the right tools, they would be able to be much more effective. The water pilots was a smaller group, and again, they were predominantly from the independent sector, and really they were much more calm. They seemed to manage to maneuver around the challenges very easily, probably because of the population they were dealing with, and definitely keen to get tech savvy when appropriate. And finally, the space seekers were a very interesting group in that they were very much looking at the individual child and what space, what context needed to be created for that child. And they know precisely how to do their jobs. They're not averse to using technology, but they're very selective in the way that they use technology to fit with the way they believe the space should be created for their students. So very interesting differences. And actually, one of the other things that came through very strongly was how poorly we understood the different concerns that people had. And so confidence, optimism, anxieties were very, very different in different communities. So for example, certainly the rhetoric of the public domain was all about falling behind. But actually, when we spoke to individuals and when we conducted our surveys, it was work-life balance that was actually the biggest concern across the multiple stakeholders, then falling behind and then feeling that they were confused by what they were meant to be doing by government. And initially for the edtech companies who were also part of our stakeholder group, their main concern originally was paying the rent, which was rated 5 out of 10. But by autumn 2020, and we started this in March 2020, it really changed. And they'd recruited so many customers because of the pandemic. They were actually, their main concern now was how could they serve them effectively? So really big difference there. And of course, a desire to serve them effectively. And then further evidence of the importance of connection and in a way, how you can do it. So parents, for example, who felt that communication from school leadership was clear, were 10 times more likely to feel confident about the way their school or their educational establishment was handling the disruption than parents who felt communication from school leadership was not clear. And communication from the small and medium edtech companies vastly improved. And they started to be seen by educators as people who could help, people who could provide support, which is what they very much moved into doing, even adjusting some of their products or services to be more useful during lockdown and when social distancing is in place in classrooms and lecture halls, etc. certainly huge amounts of evidence that educators and parents, teachers, all engaged with trying new technologies. I've never seen statistics like this. 74% of educational leaders reporting that they engaged with new technologies and recommended some of these to others. And of course, that's the biggest factor in what technology is used in education, is a recommendation from somebody you know and you respect. And self-support was fundamentally important, a big part of this ecosystem. So yes, teachers adapted to the pandemic really quickly. So in our interviews, for example, we were told as soon as someone learned how to do something, we would then share it and everybody else would know how to do it. It's that connecting, this big thing about connecting. Heads, teachers, parents mainly felt supported by their colleagues or by family members. I haven't got the stat up there, but it was about the same for colleagues and for family members or friends. Only 2.5% felt supported by government. So it's a huge problem here in that respect, mainly because of confusing messaging. But there were some interesting correlations. For example, there was a correlation between those who enjoyed and felt confident about being able to sustain remote education and those who felt supported. So being supported was really important, and collaboration was really important for the adults as well as for the students. And there was a lot of positivity about the opportunities that these restrictions would afford. So not everybody was depressed about the opportunities. 54% of our respondents believed there was an opportunity to improve the way technology was being used to support learning, which is very positive. And so finally, those barriers and challenges that we might think about breaking down, perhaps through technology and through AI in particular. Of course, there's a problem. Everywhere we know there's a problem of disparity between technical infrastructure of poor and wealthy families, students, communities, and we can see it there very clearly. Interestingly, it's much more about the demographic of the establishment than about the individual family. And I think that's because of what the institution, the school, is able to provide, which I think is interesting. But even, of course, when you've got the infrastructure and everybody has a device, unless they have a quiet space to work and them wanting to work is validated by their close community, their family, then there's still huge problems that just exacerbate that disparity. Whilst trust with small companies increased, trust with big technology companies didn't, even though they provided the vast majority of the platforms that were being used. And one of the real problems was the lack of consideration of safeguarding issues, because for many, many, many educational leaders, that was the biggest concern. And for us here, definitely lack of effective communication by government left people feeling confused and forced them to make decisions that they really weren't confident about. And so, that was mainly sort of quantitative data, but also looking at our qualitative data interviews. Yes, like 3 years of CPD, great, that's a good move, isn't it? Some people felt they were just translating rather than really leveraging the technology, but that changed over time. Teachers began to question efficiencies. They felt freed up to think about what really mattered. They saw it as an opportunity for staff and students to use technology in more profound ways. Some people regarded it as a real gift, and there was certainly a mindset that technology had a role to play. So how can AI and tech really help here? And how can we build on that positivity? Because that's a real change, that positivity and that enthusiasm. So we need to build on it. Well, I think we have to think very carefully about this ecosystem and about using the technology to connect. And I think when we're thinking about the ways in which AI in particular can be used, we need to see it not as a one hit, not as a mutually exclusive action. We need to see it much more in the round. So we can think of it in this cycle here. We need to certainly help people use AI in education, but we also need to think about how education needs to change in order to better meet the needs of a world in which AI is far more prevalent. And then we also need to think about how we help people understand AI, because that helps them to use it effectively, but it also helps with the risks, which are not insubstantial. And so if we think about this, there's that first piece, the implications around using it. Second piece, implications around what it means for education as a whole. Third piece, implications of how we help people to understand AI and tech more broadly. But if we look at that first piece, there are a plethora of pieces of AI out there readily available, if they can be afforded, for all age ranges. So on this screen, and I'll go through them individually, you have anything from AI designed for babies to AI for university students. So it's a real mixed patch out there. But really the key use of AI in a way that makes it obvious that AI is being used in education is for adaptation, is to personalize instruction. So these are two products called, created by a company in the US called Alelo, that was actually started by a university professor. And they're both shots from a software called N Skills, which is about teaching people the English language. And they interact with the avatar on the screen. You can see the character on the screen, and they have a conversation. And so the AI is used to understand what the student is saying and helps to correct them as the conversation progresses. And of course, the system collects data from thousands of students, millions of students, in fact, in order to constantly improve the way it adapts to the needs of individual students. And other systems that use this adaptivity to personalize are, for example, systems, again, produced from a university spin-off, Carnegie Learning. This is a maths program for undergraduates, but Carnegie produced products for schools as well as universities. Century Tech in the UK is a slightly different version of adaptivity in that with the N Skills and the maths program, they're very discipline specific. One's about helping students learn English, the other is about maths. Century is a platform that provides education across the curriculum. It's used in many countries in the world. It was created in the UK, and it works with schools and post-16 education, in further education, tertiary education. And again, it's adapting, but across the whole curriculum, and importantly, providing feedback to teachers. And then the sort of second category of ways in which AI can help. So those adaptive systems can certainly help when it comes to, for example, understanding how students may have fallen behind during the pandemic and helping them to get back up to speed quickly. And this kind of adaptivity, which is slightly different, recommendations, again, can be helpful in bringing people what they need quickly in order to help them get up to speed with where you need them to be in the curriculum. I mean, this is an example of a company called Filtered that actually works more in the training sector. And it's about you want to learn something, or you have an employee or a student who wants to learn something, and they can interact with the system through a chatbot interface, and the system will go away and find the most appropriate resources for that learner. So this is a way of supporting learners, but not actually tutoring them, but providing the resources that are most suitable for their needs. And this kind of recommender system exists for teachers as well. I want to find the best resources for my class. You have an interaction, and a set of resources are selected for you to choose from. But then beyond subject-based, curriculum-based, there are also ways in which AI can help psychologically, something, again, hugely important post-pandemic, real fears about mental health. And so this is uses a little bit of AI in this. Company called My Cognition that was actually originally built as an app that's been made available on our UK National Health Service to help people who are at risk of suffering from depression. And then the person who founded the company, who had originally worked in the pharmaceutical industry creating drugs to combat depression, thought, well, actually, it would be great to have something that was preventative, and wondered if this might be useful in education as well. And so this little piece of software that runs as an app on your phone conducts an evaluation of your cognitive fitness, which is broken down into executive function, attention, long-term memory, short-term memory. And then on the basis of that, you play a game called Aquasnap, and the game adapts to try and build up the areas of your cognitive fitness where perhaps you're weakest. I play this game regularly and I find it really quite helpful, an interesting use of AI. Here, moving beyond curricula or particular, focusing on particular skills or knowledge, this is a virtual counseling agent called SimSensei from University of Southern California. And the idea is that it's provide support for students, but as the student is interacting with SimSensei, the AI is capturing, or the technology is capturing, and the AI is analyzing data about the student's facial expressions, the tone, the pitch of their voice, in order to try and analyze the extent to which they're paying attention, perhaps they're bored, perhaps they're anxious, in order to adapt the way that the virtual counsellor offers support to that student. And of course, as I said, it's not just adults, it's not just school-age learners, it's also babies. This is a product from Oya Labs designed for early years, and it's that little sensor that sits in the room of an infant and listens, records, analyzes the noises, the audio that happens in that space, and then provides advice to the parents about how they can develop their child's language and cognitive ability. Excuse me. And I think the importance of this thinking post-pandemic is the way that you can monitor and provide support to parents, as well as to teachers, as well as to learners. And then finally, I think, this is a company called Third Space Learning, who are part of our tutoring catch-up program now. So really important role post-pandemic. They provide face-to-face tutoring, particularly around maths for school-age learners. And they were created to try and make this affordable, because obviously one-to-one human tutoring is the gold, isn't it? But most people can't afford it. And so the system connects tutors who they train from other parts of the world other than the UK, mainly Sri Lanka and India. They're qualified, they're trained by the organisation. The tutor interacts with the student on a one-to-one basis, no video, they use audio and a shared whiteboard, and they solve problems together. And where the AI comes into this is that the interactions between the student and the tutor are recorded and analysed. Now, most of the time, these have been evaluated by human tutors, but that's a huge cost for the company, which obviously wants to make this service affordable for most people. And so if you can use AI, which is what they're developing, and we've been helping them with this, to automate some of that evaluation, then you can bring down the costs of the product, which makes it more accessible to the people who can really benefit from it, particularly post-pandemic. And they've been the most successful of all of the tutoring companies that have been engaged on the government program here. And I think it's really nice use of AI to help make each tutoring session as effective as possible, and feeding back to the tutor as well as to the student, because the tutor feeds back to the student, but feeding back to the tutor from the system as to how they can improve, which is great. And then that second part of what we need to think about when we think about AI and helping us to recover from the pandemic, or in actual fact in education in general, is to think about, well, what do we need to think about when it comes to the future? Now, in the past, that was very much a conversation about the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, robots are taking over the world, AI is everywhere, that's changing jobs, it's changing the workplace. What do we need to do in education in order to help us cater for this? But actually, the conclusions of that are that we can't be sure, we don't know, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of reports that try and create a map, if you like, of what's going to happen. where the job losses are going to be the greatest, what skills we're going to need the most. But actually, I'm not convinced that's the right tool for the situation. And I think the pandemic has made this even more the case. Because basically, the situation we face, whether it's about the fourth industrial revolution or it's about the pandemic, is a bit like driving along a road you never ever navigated through before in very, very thick fog. And in that situation, a map of the city is not necessarily the most useful thing you can have because you can't see where you're going. Actually, what's far more important in this situation is to know that you've got a reliable car, it's got good brakes, steering works well, you've got petrol in the tank. As the driver, you're not sleep deprived, you're not under the influence of alcohol or drugs, you've got lights that work, you can see well, you hear well, you've not got your headphones on listening to music when you should be trying to concentrate on what's going on around. So it's actually, what is it that we can do to make ourselves most capable of dealing with these unforeseen circumstances? And so when I was writing this little book here, which although it has a child on the cover, is really not just for children, it's about any learner and about intelligence in general. I was trying to think, well, if I'm here and I'm thinking about how do I engage in teaching and learning in a way that's going to help me be resilient to whatever comes my way, AI, pandemic, whatever it is, what do I need? And when I was thinking about this, I was particularly thinking about artificial intelligence. And one of the big issues that we often overlook, but I think is really important for thinking about how we can leverage AI in education, is how artificial intelligence is very different to human intelligence. And what is it that's different? And so I thought very carefully about human intelligence and how it might be useful to reframe it for an AI world so that we could draw more distinction between the differences. And so I like to think of our rich human intelligence as being, yes, about interdisciplinary academic intelligence. That's very important, particularly being interdisciplinary. But it's also about meta-knowing. In other words, we might call epistemic cognition, understanding what knowledge is. Where does knowledge come from? Where does my knowledge come from? How can I be sure that I should believe this thing to be true or false? What's evidence? What's good evidence look like? Social intelligence, for humans, that's so important. It's how we learn, it's how we interact. It's a big part of being human. And then really, there's a lot of meta-intelligences, which is all about our ability to understand ourselves in different ways, something that is virtually impossible for AI to do. So metacognitive intelligence, of course, about understanding, being able to regulate, being able to make good assessments of our own cognitive processes. Metasubjective intelligence, this is about understanding how we are or are not developing emotional intelligence, and indeed how those around us are or are not developing their emotional intelligence. Huge implications for social intelligence, for example. Metacontextual intelligence, something that we often overlook, and really this is incredibly hard for AI. The ability that we have to move seamlessly through the world. Yes, sometimes we get a jolt when we land up in a situation that's not what we expected, but actually even then we're pretty good at dealing with it. I know when we were allowed to travel around the world in planes, I could really get on a plane, arrive in a country I'd never been to, work my way through the airport, find my way to where I was meant to be. Sometimes the language be a problem, but you generally find a way of working it out. You could kind of order a meal. Sometimes you didn't get exactly what you were expecting, but generally it worked out fine. Oh, that's so hard for AI. And it's a form of intelligence that we really underestimate. And then if we get all of these together, and they're not individual intelligences, they're different aspects of an interwoven whole, there's this notion of perceived self-efficacy, which is all about the extent to which we understand ourselves. Can we set appropriate goals? Can we assess how likely we are to achieve them? Can we evaluate what we need in order to be able to achieve those goals? Who can help us? How do we learn? Where can we find the information? How can we bring a team together to help us with this challenge? And how can we help them to interact effectively? And so it's extremely complex and, believe me, way beyond anything AI has to offer. At the moment, and I would argue for a very long time, AI can do relatively well with the interdisciplinary academic intelligence, can do pretty well at assessing evidence, but it's not foolproof for sure. And it can help with social intelligence, and to an extent, it can demonstrate some forms of social intelligence, but certainly nothing like we can. As for the rest, it's really nowhere. And so for me, it seems really important that we think about how we develop the aspects of our human intelligence that we can't automate rather than the ones that we can. And those kinds of aspects of our intelligence will be super important for being resilient to whatever the future has to throw at us. I mentioned a moment ago that there are risks with AI, and I wouldn't ever underplay them. In 2018, I was lucky enough to work with some colleagues, Anthony Selden, who's a leading educator, and Priya Luckin, who's the social entrepreneur behind Century Tech, to create the Institute for Ethical AI in Education, with the sole purpose of trying to understand the implications within education specifically of AI and what we would need in order to develop ethical AI for education. We had the sole objective of producing some useful framework for educators and developers, and now we're looking to see how that framework can be taken forward. So I really am conscious of the ethical issues, from the data that's used to the algorithms to why the AI is being used. There are huge challenges that we mustn't overlook. But one of the challenges that often is overlooked is the absolute necessity to help people understand about AI if they're going to reap the benefits that it has to offer, but also keep themselves safe. And I often think of it a little bit like this tree diagram. Yes, you want a small percentage of the population to understand the technical aspects of AI so that they can build the next generation of AI systems. And you also want some of the population to really understand the details of ethics around AI. But actually, you really want everybody to understand enough about it to know what they need in order to be effective in the workplace, in their lives, to protect their family, to protect themselves, but also to know enough about what AI can do and what AI can't do. So I don't believe people all have to learn to program or to understand the complicated maths that's parts of a neural network, but they do need to understand something about, for example, why is data so important to machine learning, which is a form of artificial intelligence. And we've developed a program for particularly aimed at educators and trainers. Oh, I can hear somebody. Oh, they've gone. Particularly aimed at educators and trainers. And really it's at the organizational level to try and help them get ready for AI, particularly post-pandemic. I'm quite worried that institutions, organizations with very meager financial resources will be easily persuaded into some AI product, believing it's really going to help them in this difficult situation that may not be right for them. And so this has been designed to help people get ready to leverage AI in their organization where their organization really needs it. And actually, it's a way of helping people see their organization through a data lens and an AI lens. And basically, we take organizations through these 7 steps, and the 7th one is to iterate as long as you need to in order to feel that you've got to where you want to get. And it's about bringing the community with you. It's about finding the challenges that you face. It's about identifying the evidence, the data that you already have and collecting it together. It's about recognizing that you might need to collect new data. It's about using AI techniques with that data to help you understand the challenges in ways that you haven't before. And obviously that's somewhere where you need people who do understand how to use the AI to help you. And we're now trying to develop some easy to use tools for educators and trainers so that they too can be able to do this. Because at the moment, the work we do is very much us doing it and helping the organisation. And then understanding what that data is telling you so that you know whether the challenges that you face are ones that are really suitable to be taken on by AI. And if so, what part of the challenge is the best part to apply that AI to, that valuable resource that you're going to spend on the AI, making sure it's in the right place. And if people have questions about that, I can easily give you some examples. So bearing in mind, I'm 35 minutes now and I'm just finishing. It's really about building connections in the education ecosystem, building connections between the ways in which we think about AI, so that we do it in a connected way, and that we do it in a way that tries to support educators, parents, teachers, learners, policymakers, edtech developers in that whole ecosystem by being more connected. So in conclusion, I would say as we come out of the pandemic, the way in which edtech and particularly AI can help us is if we think about the ecosystem, not silos, think about the connections and the communications, which is where tech can be really helpful. I think it's really important to think about the ecosystem, to think about where the connections didn't work well, to try and build support in that ecosystem, to try and build resilience, and thinking about how we get the best developed AI, which is all about being AI ready, but it's all about working together as well across the ecosystem. So you have your developers working with the educators and your parents and your learners. So everybody learns about each other's perspective, expertise, skills as they develop the best sorts of applications. And if anybody is curious about AI readiness, we did a set of webinars over the summer to try and help people understand this, and each one includes some content and then a conversation with somebody from the educational training space. They're all free at that link if anybody is interested, and I'll happily share my slides afterwards. And there's also some potentially useful publications, I hope, there too. So that's me done. Sorry, it was more than 30 minutes, 37 minutes to be precise. But hopefully there's some food for thought there, and hopefully you'll have lots of questions. Thank you very much for listening.